Hello and welcome to Lesson 4 of the Games for All Game Design Challenge. My name is Lindsay Buckle, and I'm the Manager of Strategy here at Legends of Learning. And we are so excited that you're joining us here today. Our goal is to empower students through a virtual game design challenge with support from game development professionals. Experts from Dell Technologies, Code Combat, Unity, Roblox, gamers, and Exploding Kittens are thrilled to be able to share their knowledge with students all over the world. They'll be discussing everything from game development to prototyping and all the way to playtesting. And if you're a winner, you'll receive a premium swag bag with games from each of these amazing companies. Today, we'll be diving into Lesson 4 of the Game Design Challenge. The final lesson of our challenge, Lesson 4 explores how to playtest your game with other people and why it's critical to put the finishing touches on your design. Here to speak with you all about Lesson 4 is Carol Mertz from Exploding Kittens. Carol,
hi, everybody.
Hi, Carol.
Sorry.
Carol is a senior game designer at Exploding Kittens. With a 15-year career in interactive arts and media, her award-winning work centers around creating and supporting playful projects that expand our perspective, help us learn about ourselves and each other, and challenge the typical boundaries of play. Carol has had the pleasure of working on several published tabletop games, dozens of indie video games, including 2 on major consoles, and multiple playful installations that have toured the United States. Today, Carol is going to share test, tweak, and test again using player feedback to pump up your project. After her presentation, we're going to open the floor to your questions. So Carol, take it away.
Thank you so much for that wonderful intro, Lindsay. I'm so excited to share this with you all. Let me go ahead and get my presentation up and rolling so we can take a look at how to test, tweak, and test again. Because spoiler alert, that's what goes into playtesting. So let's get into it. Hi, as Lindsay said, I'm Carol Mertz. I am a senior game designer at Exploding Kittens, and I have worked on loads of other kinds of games, which you can see here on the screen, from video games to board games to fun, playful installations. You can see I even made an interactive sofa. So I've done all kinds of stuff, and all of these different projects required a massive amount of testing. So that's why we're going to be diving into that today. For those of you who are not aware, Exploding Kittens is a party game company. So we publish a lot of digital and tabletop party games. You might be familiar with our flagship game, Exploding Kittens, which has, just permeated the market. And we've also published games like Throw Burrito, which I understand is part of your prize pack for this challenge, as well as its sequel that you can see here on the screen, Throw Avocado, and other games like Poetry for Neanderthals and Bears versus Babies and Taco Cat and Little Wordy and loads of other fun games. So let's start the talk. What is playtesting? That's the big question, right? So you may have heard us talk about this. You obviously saw it on the website as part of the curriculum. What ultimately is playtesting, and what does it have to do with your game? Well, if any of you have taken any sort of science classes, I love to actually compare the process of game design to the scientific process. And I'm going to explain to you what playtesting is by comparing game design to the scientific process. And I promise it's not as boring as it sounds. But when scientists try to solve problems and figure out things in their research, what they do is they start with a question. They say, what if X? And to explore what if X, they go into research, they dive into it, they really study, okay, well, if I have to figure out what if X, what do I need to know to understand that, right? And so that's how they form their hypothesis. They say, I think that if I can do A, B, C, I'll understand more about X, right? And so that's their hypothesis. That's the question that they ask themselves and the way that they frame their research, right? And so they build their experiment to try to support that hypothesis. And then they take a look at the results of that experiment, they analyze the data, they analyze the results, and then they generally will have to redefine their hypothesis based on those results. And then they do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again until they finally draw the conclusion they're looking for, right? The game design process, as you might have guessed based on the fact that I'm comparing these two things, is very similar. So in game design, we start with our idea for what we think is going to be fun, right? And then we start researching and we start trying to develop that concept, and we start trying to think of what constraints are going to help us, be able to manifest that idea, what mechanics, what systems, what themes, what aesthetic, what look and feel are going to help us figure out what that thing is that we think is going to be fun, right? And then once we have an idea of what we want to do, that's when we build our prototype. This is like our hypothesis. Our prototype is us saying, if I put together these mechanics in a playable build, right, then it's going to be fun. That's essentially what our prototypes are, right? And so in order to figure out if our prototype is actually doing what we want it to do, that's where playtesting comes in, right? So we playtest, we check with our players, and we try to determine, is this actually doing what I want it to do? Most of the times the answer is no, because nobody's perfect and no prototype is going to do exactly what you want it to do right off the bat, right? So then we revise it, we update it, we make a new prototype, we make changes to that prototype, and we test again. And we keep doing that loop until we determine that it's fun enough to say, all right, this is my game, it's done. That's a really hard thing to do. But that said, play testing is like running an experiment to see if your idea works, right? It's that simple. So why do we play test? And this is, it's a good question. Why do we play test? If we're good designers, why should we have to play test if we know that we're good at what we do? The truth is, we never know. we have to play test, because play testing is a core part of game design. We're not mind readers. We can hypothesize, we can think, we can come up with ideas and say, I think this is going to be fun. But the truth is, even the best game designers can't possibly know how their players are going to respond to their prototype. And so play testing is integral. Play testing is so important. And the fact is, playtesting simply makes games better, right? So this is why we playtest, because we want to make our game as good as it can be. Playtests answer really important questions about our game. Playtests tell us if our game is fun or if it's interesting to the people who are playing it. Playtests tell us, does it make sense? Are my players getting stuck? Do they understand what I'm trying to tell them? Are there major problems or bugs? This is a really important part of playtesting, especially early on when you're just learning how to program and you're just learning how to build out a game. Playtesting can show you these unexpected things that your players may find that you might not know are there. And that tells you how you can make very obvious changes and updates to fix your prototype and try again. Playtesting also tells us if there's unexpected moments or if our players are responding in ways that we wouldn't expect. This gives us an insight into what's going on in our players' heads and how we can update our game and change our prototype to make it really resonate and hit home even more than it may have been doing at the beginning. So playtesting makes games better and it answers questions for us. Playtesting also helps us develop games for everybody. As I understand, Games for All is the core part of this year's curriculum, and it is so important to make sure that everyone can play your game, right? So playtests help us answer questions about how our games can reach even more people. Playtests can answer whether your game is accessible and inclusive to players who have different backgrounds, different abilities, different identities. Playtests can tell you if there's things in the game that might be accidentally hurtful or insensitive to people with different identities, because we can't always know that without having somebody tell us, right? And playtesting can tell us if there's ways that we can make our games more accessible and more inclusive that we may not have considered until we saw somebody running into trouble while they're playing it, right? So playtesting helps us make games that reach more people and are ultimately more accessible and more inclusive. All right, so we've talked about what playtesting is and why we playtest, but the big question is, how do we do it, right? We know we have to, we know what it is. So how do we do it? Well, the first thing that we need to do to be able to playtest is to find people to play our game. We need to find playtesters. So when we're looking for playtesters, we're looking for people who have never played your game before. This is going to be really important because you're looking for the kinds of people who are going to be playing your game just when it's out in the wild, right? So say you put your game up on a website like itch.io or up on Steam or up on, up online somewhere, and you're not going to be sitting next to them when they're playing it. So you can't tell them how to play, right? So you need to find people who've never played before and watch how they respond to the game. You need to find people who have different kinds of abilities. This is physical ability, cognitive ability, different kinds of gameplay abilities. All of these are going to inform the things that you can look for in the game and how you can change the game to make it more accessible to all of those different abilities. You want to find people who are different age ranges, young folks, older folks. That's all going to inform how different people respond, and they're all going to react differently to your game. We also similarly want to find people who have different backgrounds and identities, people from different parts of the world, people who were raised in different situations, people who have different identities. They all, like I said, with age, they are all going to respond differently to your game. And it's important to see how different people respond and the different kinds of questions people ask. Similarly, we want to find people who have different levels of game skill and like different kinds of games. So we want to find people who may not have played a lot of games in the past, but also maybe people who really love games and have played loads of them. Because again, it's going to give you a different perspective. And that's what we're looking for when we test our games, is different perspectives. So when we have these people, now what do? We of course, we have them play the game, right? But the number one thing to remember is to get out of the way and let them play. I'm going to say that again because it's so important. You have to get out of their way and just let them play, right? Because again, you want to see how they might react in an environment where you as the designer are not there looking over their shoulder and are not there and able to ask questions. So you want to avoid answering their questions. It's great if they ask them. It's super important for them to ask them, in fact. But it is also super important for you to try to let them figure it out on their own, because that's how you figure out if your game is really directing them and guiding them in the way that you want it to, right? So the other thing that you're going to want to do while you're watching people play your game is write everything down that you see. So that includes all those questions that they're asking that you're not responding to, but it also includes those moments of confusion, frustration, or discomfort that they have while they're playing the game. So if you notice they get stuck at a point, they may not ask a question about it, but it's important that you write it down so you can figure out, okay, what happened? What caused them to get stuck right there? And what can I do to help guide them through it? You also want to write down points of celebration and excitement, moments when they laugh, moments when they smile, because that means you're doing something right, right? And that means that you want to try to find more moments where you can bring that into the game. It's also really important while you're doing this and at the end of the playtest to ask open-ended questions. What do I mean by open-ended questions? So talking to your playtesters and hearing their thoughts is a huge part of playtesting, because that's going to give you all of the information, a lot of the information rather, that you're going to need from these playtests. So a lot of the information comes from watching them and observing their nonverbal communication. And a lot of it is going to come from talking to them and getting their verbal communication. So we want to avoid, when I say that we're looking for open-ended questions, what I mean is that we want to avoid yes or no only questions, right? Like, was it fun? Because when you ask someone, hey, was the game fun? Did you like my game? They're gonna want to answer yes because they don't want to hurt your feelings. And that's not going to give you the data that you need, right? That's not going to necessarily tell you how you can change the game or make it better. Even if they say no, it might just hurt your feelings. And it's still not going to give you the information that you need, right? So you want to ask things like, hey, I noticed that you responded in a certain way to this point in the game. Can you tell me more about that? How did you feel during that time? Or what moments did you feel stuck or confused during the game? Or like on the other side of that, what moments did you enjoy or that felt particularly memorable to you? And finally, who would you play this with? Or in what context would you find yourself playing this on your own? And one of the yes or no questions that I do tend to ask is, would you play this again? Because that tells you not only whether or not they liked it, but if they're, if they're interested and excited to play it more. One thing that I do want to really quick talk about as a quick anecdote, a quick story that relates to this, is that not all of your playtesters are going to give you, so a lot of your playtesters are going to give you feedback that feels very directed, right? So feedback that is very specific on how they think that you should change your game. And I'm going to say most of the time they're wrong because you're the designer and they're not the designer. So what they're doing is they're asking you to change something that they think is going to make their experience better. But ultimately, as the designer, it's important for you to listen to that feedback and try, instead of making that change directly, instead think about what caused them to suggest that change and think about ways that you can change your game based on the way that you want to change it that might address that. So I have an example from the game Borderlands, which some of you may have heard of. There's a Polygon article, and I'll put the title of the article here in case you want to look it up. But there's a Polygon article called How Gearbox's Truth Team Outwitted Borderlands Feedback. And this is an example of listening to your playtesters, but not taking their word so literally, right? So playtesters were playing this one level called Skag Gully, and they were running into all these clusters of enemies while they were moving through the gully, right? And they felt like, I'm getting so frustrated. They were offering feedback saying that it wasn't fun, it was boring, and that there were just too many enemies. Well, the developer actually looked at that feedback and decided to add in 3 times as many enemies instead of taking out the enemies, because what they wanted that area to be was not necessarily an area where people just wandered through comfortably. They wanted it to be a combat area. They wanted it to be really intense and really exciting and really pivotal. And they wanted people to really like either rush through it and try to avoid combat or really engage in combat, right? They didn't want people to just kind of meander in it. And that solved their problem when they increased the number of enemies instead of taking the enemies out. So that's an example of listening to your playtesters' feedback and identifying why they might be saying something, and then addressing it in the way that you want to address it as the developer, as the designer. All right, and so one last thing about how to play test is that I acknowledge that I come from Exploding Kittens. I'm a senior game designer working primarily on tabletop games. So I want to talk about the quick differences between testing video games versus testing board games. And the truth is, it's a very similar process. The big difference is that with board games, we have written instructions that we have to test, and we have to make sure that all those instructions are completely clear to our players, right? So we have to make sure that without any additional instruction from anybody else in the room, that somebody who's picking up that game for the very first time can get through it entirely without making major mistakes, completely clear, without any help, right? And so this generally happens after we already do play testing to make sure that the game is fun and to make sure that people aren't getting stuck and confused and frustrated, right? This is to make sure simply that the instructions are working. So it is similar in that you want your video games to be clear in that same way, but it's an added step. It's an extra step for board games. So if you're working on a board game for this challenge, or if you find yourself working on a board game in the future, just keep that in mind that you want to test the instructions as well as the gameplay. All right, so you ran a play test, right? So now that we know what it is, why we're doing it, and how to do it, what now? What, right? What's next? Well, we do that loop, that scientific process loop, right? So we updated it, we take a look at that feedback, we reflect on our notes, we find where folks aren't responding the way that we want them to. We find those moments where they're having trouble. We find those moments where we're having a great time, and we update our game. We think of ways that we can improve and enhance those experiences. We're also, we're just going to constantly be making changes, and we're also going to test again, right? So we're just doing that loop. We're going to do it a lot, because every single time we test, we are going to discover new things that we can improve, right? So playtesting can also benefit a lot from polish. So you're going to see that your players are going to respond way better to your game after you've added a little layer of polish. And so I'm going to take this last section of this presentation to talk a little bit about how to make your game shine. So in the industry, this is what we call juice, right? So juice, or game feel, you may have heard, is this really hard to like define extra stuff on top of your game that makes it more fun to play. It pumps up the experience, it immerses your players. And so this GIF that you're seeing right now is an image from Candy Crush, and it is loaded with juice. You can see these animations and these bounces and these lights and these numbers, and it's all just really exciting and engaging, even though it's just little pieces of candy on your screen, right? So when we are adding juice and we're adding polish, the first thing that we want to do, it's probably the easiest thing, is take away all of the default stuff. If you're working in something like Unity, take away that Unity default blue, you know, add in your own color, add in your own flair, take away the default fonts, add in your own special look and feel to those things that the engine might try to add for you. Just give it a little bit of personality. You'll also want to add sound effects and music to really add that feedback, that ambiance, that feeling. It really pumps up the emotional feel of the game once you add those things. Imagine this GIF, but with music behind it and with all the sound effects that you can probably imagine in your head of where they should be, and like the things that are really going to enhance all of those fun popping moments and, you know, the lightning and stuff. You'll also want to think about adding little animations, like interface animations, button animations. You can see in this GIF the little score numbers animate up really nicely and fade off. And that's a really, like, it's a small, but it's a really important kind of addition. Same with screen shake. You might hear about this as a fun little way to add a lot of impact to things like explosions and, you know, different impacts and different moments that it just really makes the moment feel just very intense. And it's a really easy way to add that level of intensity. Adding particles is another really great one. This GIF again shows a lot of particles. Every time the candies explode, little bits of the candies fly off and little sparkles pop up. The center candy shoots out all these lightning bolts. It all makes it just feel so interesting and exciting. Similarly with lighting, you can change, add lights to your scene and make it a little bit more moody or bright or exciting. And you can add in a lot of background details, so little background animations, a little personalization here and there. Literally every detail that you add is going to add a level of polish, and that's going to feel really good to your players. So the next thing I want to talk about when it comes to adding polish is adding menus. A lot of people leave this to the last minute, but menus really help your game feel finished, right? Starting with a start screen, having a place where you can start the game, load the game, pause the game, things like that. Like, it really makes it feel like it's a complete package as opposed to just a little prototype, right? So adding in that start screen, that's the first thing I would suggest for a little bit of polish. Make sure that there's a place that somebody can say, yes, I'm ready to play this game. Similarly, adding in a pause screen so that people can say, I need to take a second. They hit the escape button and then suddenly, the game's paused. There doesn't even have to be anything else on the screen other than the unpause button, but just giving them a way to just kind of take a step back from the game if they need to is a really nice way of showing that you're thinking about your players. Similarly, the settings screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, but adding customizable settings to your game is really going to help a lot, again, in giving your players an opportunity to make it feel like it's their own. Adding a credits or an end screen helps it feel wrapped up, and it also gives you a chance to credit the other people who are working on it. And putting in thoughtful user interface, or what we call a HUD or a heads up display, gives your players the information that they're looking for. So thinking about what do they need to know at any given time? Do they have points or lives, or do they need a map to be able to get to where they want to go? Really, the idea here is just to make sure they're getting the information that they need. And quickly, again, so we're seeing the Stardew Valley start screen, which I love. It gives us all the information that we need from a start screen. The Stardew Valley heads up display is also really great. It shows us all of our items at the bottom. It shows us our energy level at the bottom right. It shows us the day and the time and how much money we have. It basically gives us a one-stop glance at basically everything that's going on in the game for us. So it's really nice. It's a really nice example of a good heads-up display. And finally, but last but absolutely not least, this is an incredibly important part of game design and polish, is creating accessible player experiences. So this is sometimes shortened to the term APX, but accessible player experiences make sure that everyone can play your game regardless of their abilities. So when we're thinking about accessibility, when we're thinking about making sure that everyone can play our game, we're thinking about things like volume settings. Are people sensitive to sound? We want to make sure that they're able to turn up or down the sound depending on if they're hard of hearing or if they're really sensitive to certain sounds. We want to think about color blindness settings. We want to make sure that, we're choosing colors, or that players can choose colors that they can discern if they have color blindness problems. Or we can also change text size or speed. We can turn on or off screen shake. We can turn on or off controller vibrations. We can add customizable control schemes so that people can use different buttons depending on what their hands depending on what their controllers are best used for. We can also change the display settings. So this means, changing flashing and motion blur and brightness and things like that. We can change difficulty settings. And there's loads more things that we can do to make sure that our games are accessible. And there's a lot of information at accessible.games, the website. This is a website that has been put together by Able Gamers, which is a nonprofit organization that does a lot of research and support for players, just so that everybody can play games. And I do want to really quick point out that this menu that you're seeing on the screen right now is the accessibility menu from a game called Tunic, which recently came out, I think, on Xbox and on Steam. And it's getting a lot of praise because it's including these things like vibration, screen shake, and as well as no fail mode, so that players don't have to worry about dying, as well as no stamina restrictions, so that they can just play the way that they want to play. And that is it. So thank you all so much for listening to me to share more information about playtesting and polish. I hope you got a lot out of it, and I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you so much, Carol. What an amazing look into the rewards of both playtesting your game multiple times and then taking that extra time at the end to really polish it and make it an experience that everyone wants to engage in. So thank you so much. This was really, really insightful with so many great examples that students can pull from when creating their own designs. So now we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions. So if you have any questions for myself or for Carol, you can go ahead and submit them in the question and answer box now. And while everyone's typing it up, we do have some questions that are already ready. If you're ready, Carol.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So the first one is, what is a proper way to watch your players if you aren't paying them and you don't have physical access to them? Would you suggest asking them to save their gameplay or asking them to stream it for you while they're playing?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that you can do this. Streaming while they're playing is a really good option. A lot of times what we do is ask them to just record themselves. If they want to put their phone behind them and record themselves while they're playing, that way you can also get their feedback while they're playing themselves, and you can get their facial expressions. You can get, you can hear their questions as they're asking it. So that's usually my favorite, but also streaming so that they have the camera on their face and you can see, them playing the game. That's also really great. So usually you want to reach out to, friends who are comfortable doing that, or folks who who might be comfortable doing that. But yeah, there's also software, and I cannot think of it right now, but there is a software tool that lets you actually stream from your computer to someone else's. And help me if why can't I think of it? It might come to me, but there are tools that allow you to basically, so that they don't have to download it. They can just stream it directly from your computer.
Very cool. Yeah, that's
Hmm.
awesome. I also really like that point that you pointed out about wanting to see their facial expressions. So it's
Hmm.
not just what they're doing on the screen, but it's also, they're are they frustrated? Are they excited? And you can see that through their body language.
Yeah, body language is a huge part. Like I said during the presentation, a part of what you're looking for from your playtesters is what they're saying verbally, but a huge part of what you're looking for is also those points of nonverbal communication when they're expressing themselves while they're playing it, but not necessarily verbally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hmm.
Awesome. So the next question is, after an iteration, once you've applied, points from your players' feedback, should you ask
Hmm.
the same players to try it again or search for new ones that know nothing about your game?
Hmm. I think a big part of that depends on what you're looking for, right? So if you want to see somebody experiencing it from scratch, that's a really, that's a really important part of it. And you're definitely going to want to have a new player play it eventually. But I think also going back to previous players and seeing how they respond and how they feel about updates can also provide you really valuable information. I just wouldn't recommend relying on that because, once they've already played it one time, they have some insight into how to get to where they need to go in the game. So even if you've updated it to try to remove some of those blockages and some of those, to address some of those points of feedback, yes, you can get their opinion on those changes, but no, you're not going to get a completely fresh perspective to tell you if those changes really address the problem. So yeah, try both,
Yeah,
but
that's a
definitely
great answer.
prioritize brand new players. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, try both. Go back and also do some new people to get all of the different
Hmm.
perspectives as you're going through the process.
Hmm.
Awesome. So this one is kind of a dual part question. The first part is, what is the proper amount of players to try your game iteration? And the second part is,
Hmm.
what is a proper duration for a playtesting session?
That's a great question. So, again, it kind of depends on what you're looking for when you're playtesting. We don't usually do more than probably 5 to 10 people with any different iteration. And that's getting a lot of data, even with 5 to 10 people. So, to start, I would even just look at like 1 to 2 different people and just try to identify the issues that are arising from those folks. See if you think that they're, likely to occur again, or look at the first person and then look at the second person and see where they might have overlapping issues. That's a really good point of data that you can have. But to keep things simple, yeah, start with a small number of play testers and then revise and iterate based on that, and then move forward from there. A reasonable duration for the playtest session is, again, really going to be dependent on your game. Ideally, you want them to play through the full game, but also, if your game is 10 hours, that's really difficult to do. So,
Yeah.
what we a lot of times talk about in the games industry is having a vertical slice, right? So, this is a portion of your game that feels representative of your full game, right? That players can play through and see all of the aspects of the game that they might see in the fuller version, and be able to provide feedback on all of those different systems, all of those different mechanics, all of those different interactions. So that's going to be more of a thing when you're working on a very large scale game. But for prototypes, like what I imagine y'all are doing for this particular program, you probably want to allocate enough time so that they can get through the full game.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's great when you're working with a smaller prototype to get that full game loop. But that's really cool
Hmm.
to hear about what they do for these larger games and doing that vertical
Hmm.
slice. That's awesome. Great. And then we have one more question about play testing. And it is,
Hmm.
this may vary game to game, but how do you know when a game is finished? Therefore, it no longer needs iteration cycles. I know this is probably a hard one to answer.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is it's kind of impossible to know that. It's the joke about like art is only done when you like art is never done really, but like it's only done when you say it's done, and you have to say it's done and decide it's done. But even, games that have already been released, people still make updates to those when they're getting feedback from their players even after it's launched. So, it's a lot of times it's based on the timeline when you want to launch it, how you feel comfortable with it, and you just saying, okay, this is good enough. We're just going to call it finished. I hate to say, you have to decide when it's good enough, but you really do, as a designer, have to decide when it's good enough. and when it satisfies your needs, because people do sometimes get stuck in a loop. And it's really easy to, because especially if you're a perfectionist like me, you just want it to be perfect. You want it to reach as many people as possible, and you want it to be perfect for as many people as possible. But we always do have to decide that it's time to release it. So maybe once you get through a few playtest iterations and people aren't getting stuck anymore, there's no huge overwhelming issues that feel like they're really preventing people from enjoying your game. That's probably the point at which you can say, all right, I think this is where I want it to be. But ultimately, you as the designer, as the artist, you have to make that decision yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a good way to think about it, is you're an artist and this is a piece of
Mhm.
artwork. And, part of your role as the artist is making that final decision. And it can be a little scary, but it can also be really, really exciting to be able to make that.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. And then moving on from playtesting, we did have one question about the juice that you talked about.
Mhm.
And that's, when adding juice, is there a fine line between too much juice and accessibility?
That's a good question. And we talk about in our the ways that we can make our games more accessible is having those settings that allow us to kind of scale the amount of juice, right? Because sometimes flashing lights are a problem, sometimes screen shake is a problem, sometimes motion blur is a problem, things like that. I think playtesting is going to help. If people are getting sick when they're playing your game, that might be too much juice, and that has been a problem. We see that with VR a lot, but we also see it with, smaller indie games where they just get really motivated and really excited about adding in a whole bunch of polish like that. But yeah, that's really where playtesting is going to inform you if you're going a little bit over the top. And if you think that you're pushing something, I mean, it's always good to like test the boundaries and push the limits. But if you think that you might be doing that, you might want to add a little setting that allows people to tone it back for their own comfort level.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's such the perfect way to find that line, is by having the
Hmm.
juice that you want, but having those settings so people can adjust the juice to the amount that works best for them.
Hmm.
Awesome. And then we have one last question before we wrap it up here today. And it's kind of a fun one. But what was your favorite game that you've ever play tested?
Oh my goodness. Well, we were talking about this a little bit before the stream, but I hacked a sofa a few years ago and toured the country with it. It's a it's a playable sofa where there's a demon trapped inside the sofa, and there's lights on the sofa, and there's sounds, and it's basically like Simon Says, but you're playing it with your tush. And so each of the couch cushions has a button inside it that has a pressure sensor, basically. And so watching people play, and they're sitting and standing up based on what the lights are doing, watching people play on this sofa and jumping up and down and having a great time. And then we actually hacked a fog machine, so it blasted fog out at their feet when they were done with the game, and just watching their joy was really, really exciting to see. And we made so many changes based on the play testing, and seeing like how sensitive do the pressure sensors need to be, how bright do the lights need to be, how loud does the audio need to be, how fast should these things change, things like that. It was so integral that we play tested that, because it's such a unique and gameplay experience. So that was definitely my favorite project that I've ever gotten to play test.
Absolutely. I mean, talk about unique. That is so
Yeah.
fun. And I'm sure your playtesters had a great time too.
Oh yes, yeah. We called it, because it was the entire shtick of the game is that you're releasing a demon from the sofa. We called it exorcism exercise.
Oh my gosh.
Very silly.
Very fun, very fun. Awesome. Well, two other quick questions came in, some little late ones, but here we go. Did you mention, or would you suggest writing a hypothesis on how you think people will react to your game?
Mhm. So I didn't suggest necessarily writing that down, but that is a really good point, because as designers, really when we're creating our prototype, we are constantly hypothesizing how we think that players are going to react. We design something a certain way because we want players to act in a certain way, right? We want players to do something. And so the prototype itself is what I consider your hypothesis, right? So I think it is good, especially if you're early on in your design career, to maybe write down how you think that players are going to respond in certain situations so you can see how your play tests add up to that. But ultimately, that is really what the design process is thinking about how do I think a player is going to respond, and how do I design this in such a way that I think the player is going to act in the way that I hope they do.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it's like when you make a game, you're hoping that people are going to feel or think or react in a certain way. And
Hmm.
then what you're doing is really testing how well you did on
Hmm.
those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And then the last one is, what is the earliest development stage where you should start playtesting? Is it once you have a
Yeah,
prototype, once you have a vertical slice, or something else?
honestly, I recommend you start playtesting as soon as possible. It's that moment when you can really prove, is this mechanic even working? And I will say, when you playtest early stuff, you might want to test with people who are also maybe developers, so that they can forgive the rough around the edges nature of your prototype. But it will give you an opportunity to get some insight and to see how players respond even to your early hypotheses, right? So even to these ideas of like, is this mechanic going to work well? Is this initial design of the level? Like a lot of times, if you're doing a 3D space or something, we call laying out the level a gray box. If you just lay it out without any sort of art or anything like that, and just watch people navigate through the level, that gives you an idea of whether or not that level is working, and if the art that you add in is going to help. So definitely try to get folks playing as early as you can in the process.
Absolutely. Yes. Starting that playtesting and bringing those members in to really give you that feedback can help,
Hmm.
even at the very beginning, guide your way to a really successful game.
Hmm.
Awesome.
Definitely.
Well, I want to thank you all for your incredibly thoughtful questions. This has been a great question and answer session. I know I learned a lot more about playtesting and polish. But if any other questions arise as you continue to work through your projects, you can feel free to email them to events@legendsoflearning.com, and we'd be more than happy to answer them. I will be following up with an email after this video with the links that Carol mentioned. And so look out in your inbox for those as well if you want to explore a little bit more the accessibility site, or how Gearbox Truth to you, dealt with the feedback that they got as well. But at this point, we'd like to wish you good luck on the last few days of the challenge. And we hope you have an amazing time playtesting and polishing your designs. And I know ourselves here at Legends, the IGDA, and Exploding Kittens absolutely cannot wait to see all of your submissions on May 1st. Thanks so much and have a great day.